Picture this. You're in a courtroom, you've been wrongly accused, and the evidence it's about to seal your fate, well, it's something that sounds really scientific, but it's actually full of holes. That's the scary reality of what people call junk science, and unfortunately, it happens more than you'd think. We're going deep into the world of junk science today.
It's kind of crazy how much we as humans, we crave certainty, especially when we're talking about something as serious as a crime. We want those really clear answers.
Right.
But, that desire for a clear answer, it can actually make us more likely to just accept bad science. Like it's the absolute truth.
So we kind of fall into this trap.
Mm,
We want certainty so much that we forget to think critically.
exactly.
And it seems like a lot of the problem is centered around what they call pattern matching evidence.
Yeah.
Trying to match fingerprints or bite marks to a suspect.
Hmm.
And the stuff we've been reading, it really shows how often this goes wrong.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Let's take fingerprints. They've been seen as like the gold standard. I mean,
Yeah.
But the truth is, the rate of false positives with fingerprints is way higher than people realize. I mean, we're talking as high as 1 in 18 in some cases.
1 in 18. That's a huge number when you think about someone's freedom, their whole life hanging in the balance.
And it really makes you wonder if even fingerprints, something we've used for so long, if even that can be so misleading. What about things like bite mark analysis, which is a much newer method? It tries to match bite marks to a suspect's teeth, but there is a ton of debate about how accurate it really is.
There's that case of Michael West, that bite mark analyst down in Mississippi.
Oh, yeah.
Really disturbing stuff. He made these wild claims, like he could see bite marks under a special UV light that nobody else could see.
Right?
People went to prison based on what sounds like honestly made-up evidence.
It just shows you, forensic science, even though it sounds objective, it's still done by people, and people make mistakes. Sometimes they're biased, and sometimes, let's be honest, they're even dishonest. And this brings us to a key point. This isn't just about a few bad apples, it's about problems with the whole system itself.
So it goes deeper than just a few rogue experts.
Hmm.
What are some of the systemic issues that cause this junk science to show up in court?
Well, one of the biggest things is something called confirmation bias. That's where investigators, they get fixated on a suspect early on, and then they start interpreting all the evidence to fit their theory, even if the science doesn't back it up.
So they've already decided who's guilty in their mind, and then they try to make the evidence fit that story.
Exactly. And another issue is that some experts, they're just really reluctant to admit that their methods might have flaws, even when there's evidence right in front of them. They might say, well, look, I've put away a ton of criminals using this technique, as if that means it's guaranteed to be accurate every single time.
It's like they have this guardian angel thing going on. They think they're doing the right thing, bringing justice, even if it means bending the rules of science a bit. But that belief in methods that aren't really reliable can have terrible consequences for people who are innocent.
You're absolutely right. And that actually brings us to another kind of evidence that often seems really convincing, but can be surprisingly unreliable. Eyewitness testimony. We like to think of our memories as accurate recordings, but studies have shown that memory is way more flexible and prone to errors than we want to believe.
So you're saying that even though an eyewitness might be really convincing in court, what they're saying might not be what actually happened.
Right. Things like stress, if there was a weapon involved, or even the way law enforcement asks questions, all of those things can affect a witness's memory and lead to wrong identifications.
It's like our memories are a puzzle with missing pieces, and our brains try to fill in the blanks, but sometimes we end up creating a picture that's not quite right.
That's a great analogy. And because memory is so unreliable, eyewitness misidentification is a major factor in wrongful convictions.
It makes you think those dramatic courtroom scenes where the eyewitness points at the defendant and says, "That's the one, I saw them." But apparently, being certain doesn't always mean you're right.
Nope, it doesn't. And speaking of being certain, another example of this kind of blind trust in science is the breathalyzer.
Oh, yeah, the breathalyzer.
People see it as the ultimate proof of whether someone's been drinking, but the truth is, it's not as accurate as people think.
Really? You mean those little devices the police use can be wrong?
Yep. Studies show they can be affected by all sorts of things. The results can be way off.
So even when we think we have this clear-cut scientific answer, it might not be so simple after all.
That's right. And to really see how much damage this reliance on junk science can do, let's look at a real case. The story of Joe Bryan, a high school principal in Texas.
This is a case where junk science really messed up someone's life. Joe Bryan was convicted of murdering his wife. But he had no motive, and he had a solid alibi. So how did they convict him?
The prosecution's whole case was built on this bloodstain pattern analysis. They had an expert who testified that the blood spatters at the crime scene proved Joe was guilty. But later on, that expert's methods were totally debunked. It turned out the bloodstains didn't actually support the prosecution's theory at all.
So this guy spent years in prison because of evidence that was completely bogus.
It's awful, but it's true. And it wasn't until the bloodstain analyst himself came forward and admitted he was wrong that Joe was finally exonerated.
This case just shows how a wrongful conviction doesn't just hurt the person who's wrongly accused. It affects their family, their community, and it makes people lose trust in the whole justice system. And what's even crazier about Joe Bryan's case is that he was convicted despite some really obvious logistical problems. He would have to drive for hours in the middle of the night, commit this murder, and then get back to his hotel without anyone noticing. It just doesn't add up.
It makes you wonder how the scientific evidence could outweigh basic common sense and the fact that there was no clear motive. It seems like that need for a definitive answer to find someone to blame can sometimes make us ignore things that don't make sense. And this points to another systemic problem: the power imbalance in the justice system. The prosecution often has way more resources, more access to expert witnesses than the defense does. And that's especially true if the defendant can't afford a good lawyer.
So it's like the playing field is tilted, and the defense is already at a disadvantage when it comes to fighting questionable evidence.
Yeah, that's often the reality. It can be really hard for the defense to challenge junk science, even when they have good reason to doubt it.
Okay, we've talked about bad evidence, biased experts, and this power imbalance in the system. But what about the coroners, the people who are supposed to be the ultimate authority on death? Determining the cause of death, that's got to be a purely scientific process, right?
You'd think so, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
But in reality, the coroner's role is a lot less scientific than people realize. In lots of places, the coroner is actually an elected position, and the qualifications, they can vary all over the place.
Wait, so you're telling me that someone who might not even have proper medical training could be in charge of deciding how someone died? That's kind of scary.
It definitely raises some red flags, especially in cases where the police are involved. A coroner who's buddy-buddy with the local police department, well, they might be less likely to call a death a homicide, even if there's something fishy going on.
It's like a built-in conflict of interest. How can we trust that death investigations are impartial when the person doing them might be close to the very people who are being investigated?
That's a very valid concern, and it's one reason why people are calling for more transparency and accountability in death investigations. It's becoming more and more urgent. The research we looked at actually found that police shooting deaths are undercounted, and part of the reason is that coroners sometimes rule these deaths as accidents or suicides, even when the evidence doesn't really support that.
Wow, that's really disturbing. It sounds like there's a systemic bias to protect law enforcement, even when their actions might have caused someone's death.
That's exactly the concern, and it highlights how important it is to have independent oversight of coroners and medical examiners, especially when you're dealing with potential police misconduct. We need to make sure those investigations are completely objective, and that the people deciding how someone died are not influenced by outside pressure.
Okay, so we've talked about flawed evidence, biased experts, and these imbalances of power within the system. But are there any good guys in this story? Are there people or groups out there trying to fix these problems and make forensic science more reliable?
Absolutely. There's a growing movement, even within the forensic science community itself, to create stricter standards, admit the limitations of their field, and be more transparent and accountable.
So it's not just critics from the outside pointing fingers. There are experts who are trying to make things better from within.
Exactly. And that kind of self-reflection is really important to rebuild trust in forensic science. One of the main things they're focusing on is better training and certification for people working in forensics. That means developing more rigorous protocols for collecting and analyzing evidence and requiring stronger scientific credentials for anyone who's going to testify as an expert in court.
So raising the bar for who gets to call themselves a forensic expert, making sure they have the scientific chops to back up their claims.
Right. There's also a push for more research to validate these forensic techniques. A lot of these methods, especially those that involve pattern matching, have been used for years without any real scientific testing to see if they actually work.
So they've just been accepted as valid because people have been doing it that way for a long time, not because there's solid scientific proof.
That's right, and that's not okay when someone's life is on the line. Another crucial step is having independent groups overseeing these forensic labs to make sure they're not being biased or influenced by law enforcement.
Checks and balances to keep things honest, making sure the analysis of evidence is objective and not influenced by pressure to get a conviction.
Exactly. And there are lots of advocacy groups and legal organizations out there fighting hard to expose these bad forensic practices, raise awareness about wrongful convictions, and push for laws that create more accountability and transparency in the system.
Sounds like it's going to take a multi-pronged approach. Better training, more research, tougher standards, independent oversight, and people constantly speaking out against these problems. It's a big task, but it seems like it's absolutely necessary if we want forensic science to be used ethically and responsibly.
I agree. We have a long way to go, but the stakes are high. Every wrongful conviction is a failure of the system, and we have to do everything we can to stop that from happening.
Speaking of wrongful convictions, let's go back to eyewitness testimony for a minute. The research we've been looking at really stresses how unreliable our memories can be, especially in high-stress situations like witnessing a crime.
It's true. Eyewitness misidentification is one of the biggest causes of wrongful convictions, and it all comes down to the fact that human memory is just not that great. Our memories aren't like a video recording we can just play back perfectly. They're constantly being shaped and reshaped by our experiences, our beliefs, and even by the way someone asks us questions.
It's like that game of telephone we played as kids where the message gets all jumbled up as it goes from person to person.
Exactly. And that kind of distortion can have serious consequences in the legal system. Things like stress, the presence of a weapon, trying to identify someone of a different race, and just the simple fact that time has passed since the event, all of those can really mess with the accuracy of an eyewitness account.
So even if a witness seems totally sincere and confident when they're testifying, what they're saying might not actually be what happened.
That's the problem. We tend to think that someone who's confident must be accurate. But when it comes to eyewitness testimony, those two things don't always line up.
So what can we do about this? Is there any way to make eyewitness identifications more reliable and reduce the chances of someone being wrongly convicted?
There are a few things we can do. One is to use what's called a double-blind lineup, where the officer who's conducting the lineup doesn't know who the suspect is. This helps to prevent them from accidentally giving the witness clues or suggestions.
So the officer can't, even unconsciously, lead the witness towards picking a particular person.
Right. Another important step is telling the witness that the person they saw might not actually be in the lineup. That takes some of the pressure off them to pick someone, even if they're not sure.
It seems like these safeguards are all about minimizing the possibility of bias and suggestion, recognizing that memory is really fragile and easily influenced.
Exactly. And these reforms are absolutely essential if we want to make sure that eyewitness identifications are used responsibly and don't lead to more wrongful convictions.
All right, so we've talked about flawed forensic techniques, biased experts, and how unreliable eyewitnesses can be. Now let's switch gears a bit and look at something that doesn't get as much attention but is just as important: the role of coroners and medical examiners in death investigations.
You're right. Most people assume that death investigations are objective and scientific, but as we talked about earlier, it's not always that simple. The close relationship between coroners and law enforcement can create conflicts of interest, especially when you're dealing with police shootings or deaths that happen in police custody.
It's that old question: who watches the watchman? If the people who are supposed to be figuring out how someone died are too close to the police, how can we be sure their investigations are impartial?
That's the problem, and the research we've been looking at actually shows a disturbing trend. Police shooting deaths are being undercounted. It seems some coroners are reluctant to rule a death a homicide if the police were involved, even when the circumstances are suspicious.
It's like there's this systemic bias to protect law enforcement, even when their actions might have contributed to someone's death.
That's the concern, and it shows how much we need more transparency and accountability in death investigations. We need independent oversight of coroners and medical examiners, especially when we're looking at possible police misconduct.
So it's not enough to just trust that individual coroners will do the right thing. We need safeguards in place to make sure their investigations are thorough, objective, and free from any outside pressure.
Exactly. If we want justice to be served, we need to make sure death investigations are conducted with the same level of rigor and scrutiny that we apply to other types of forensic evidence.
This deep dive has really been eye-opening. We've uncovered some pretty unsettling stuff about the flaws in our justice system. But are there any signs of progress? Are we moving in the right direction when it comes to addressing junk science and making forensic practices more reliable?
The challenges are real, but there are definitely reasons to be hopeful. As we talked about, there's a growing movement within the forensic science world itself to adopt higher standards, admit limitations, and be more transparent and accountable.
So it's not just pressure from the outside. There are experts pushing for change from within.
Exactly, and that's really encouraging. Also, technology is playing a key role in exposing the weaknesses of old forensic methods. DNA analysis, for example, has been huge in exonerating people who are wrongly convicted based on shaky evidence, like bite mark comparisons or hair analysis.
It's like DNA technology is shining a light on the cracks in the foundation of forensic science, showing us just how unreliable some of those old methods really are.
That's a great way to put it. And as DNA technology keeps getting better, it's likely to challenge the validity of even more of those less scientific techniques.
All of this makes me think about the bigger picture, about how we understand truth. If we're finding out that even some of our most trusted scientific methods can be wrong, what's that say about our ability to really know anything for sure?
That's a deep question. It reminds us that truth is often hard to find, and even our most advanced investigative tools are prone to human error, bias, and interpretation.
So it's not about giving up on science or the search for truth, but about understanding that there are limits to what we can know for certain.
Exactly. We have to approach all evidence, even scientific evidence, with a healthy dose of skepticism and critical thinking. We need to ask tough questions, demand transparency, and be willing to challenge assumptions, even when they come from experts. It really feels like we're at this turning point. People are starting to see that forensic science isn't perfect, and that's actually a good thing.
Yeah, we're moving past that CSI effect, where everyone thinks every crime can be solved in an hour with fancy gadgets and computers. The real world, as we've seen, is much messier.
Right. And that change in how people see forensic science, it's pushing the field to improve, to get more rigorous, and admit that some old techniques just don't cut it.
So it's not just about catching criminals. It's about making sure the methods we use are actually reliable, so we're not putting innocent people behind bars.
Absolutely. We can't sacrifice truth and accuracy just to get a conviction. And one of the most exciting things happening is how technology is revealing the flaws in these old methods. DNA analysis has been a total game changer.
It's like DNA is the ultimate truth serum. It can tell us who was really there, who did it, and as DNA technology keeps getting better, it's going to show us even more how unreliable some of these older methods are, like bite mark analysis or hair microscopy, stuff that's been used to convict people but doesn't have a strong scientific basis.
Exactly. DNA analysis has helped free so many people who were wrongly convicted based on bad evidence, and it's only going to get more powerful.
All this makes me wonder about something bigger. If we're realizing that even our most trusted scientific methods can be wrong, what does that say about our ability to ever know anything for sure, especially in the justice system?
It's a really deep question. I think it's a reminder that truth is a tricky thing. And even with all our fancy tools and methods, we have to be humble. We can't always expect science to give us clear, easy answers, especially in something as complicated as the justice system, where you have to factor in human behavior and how people interpret things.
So it's not about giving up on science or saying we can never find the truth. It's about being realistic about what science can do, knowing that it has limits.
Right. We have to think critically, question what we're told, even when it's coming from someone who's supposed to be an expert. And maybe most importantly, we have to be willing to admit when we're wrong, change our minds when we get new information, and always, always put accuracy ahead of getting a quick result.
Like the scientific method itself, always testing, questioning, trying to get closer and closer to the truth.
That's a great way to put it. And we need that same approach in our justice system. We need to constantly look at how we're doing things, admit that mistakes happen, and work towards a system that's fair, accurate, and protects everyone's rights.
This deep dive has been quite a journey. We've learned some pretty unsettling things about how forensic science can go wrong and how the pursuit of justice can sometimes lead to injustice. But we've also seen some hopeful signs. Experts who want to reform the system, technology that's helping expose the flaws in old methods, and more people understanding that this is a problem.
I agree. And this is where our listeners come in. We can't just sit back and watch. We need to be informed, engaged citizens who demand a justice system that's based on solid science, fairness, and a real commitment to finding the truth.
So what can our listeners do to make a difference? How can they help tackle this problem of junk science and push for a better system?
Well, first of all, learn about it. Learn about the limits of different forensic techniques, the history of wrongful convictions, and the groups that are working to change things. There's a ton of information out there, online and in libraries, that can help you understand these complicated issues.
Like they say, knowledge is power. The more we know about the potential problems, the better we can spot them and speak up.
Exactly. And once you're informed, talk about it. Talk to your friends, family, neighbors, anyone who will listen. Raise awareness, correct misconceptions, and encourage people to think critically about what they hear about forensic evidence. The more we talk about this, the more likely things are to change.
And we can support the groups that are fighting for justice and trying to improve forensic science. There are organizations working on all sorts of things like improving training and standards, helping people who have been wrongly convicted, and pushing for laws that focus on accuracy and fairness. Your time, donations, even just spreading the word can make a big difference.
Absolutely. And don't forget about your elected officials. Let them know this matters to you. Tell them you want them to support laws that promote transparency and oversight in forensic science, that make sure standards are high, and that protect innocent people from being wrongly convicted.
This is an issue that affects everyone. We might not always realize it, but we're all potential jurors, witnesses, or even victims of a system that can be flawed. We have a responsibility to make sure justice is done right, not just that it looks like justice is done.
That's so important. And by working together, by expecting more from our justice system, and by remembering that real people's lives are at stake, I think we can build a future where forensic science is used the right way, ethically, and in the service of truth.
This deep dive has been a real eye-opener, but it's also a call to action. We can't just sit back and do nothing. Justice demands our attention, our involvement, and our unwavering commitment to the truth. So let's go make a difference.